Yes, yes, yes. What is up? What is up? General Strike Podcast family. The live show and the first of 2021. So Happy New Year to everyone out there. Hope everyone had a happy holidays, had a good New Year. Obviously, if you are a part of the left, it's been a tumultuous last couple weeks of the holidays, obviously. A lot of infighting. Obviously, you're going to have to talk about that, break it down from my perspective and others. I want to highlight both sides of the argument when it comes to the whole force the vote issue and Nancy Pelosi, Medicare for All, and all that entails, because that is a worthwhile topic to get into and worthy of discussion, too. Like, I feel like there's a lot of people dismissing aspects of this discussion, this discourse, as we overuse that word, that are valid. Like, I think there's some benefit to this friction that is happening on the left, because any political movement is going to have friction within it. Like, that's just how every political group and movement has functioned throughout history. It's just the imperfection of reality. You have to accept that. But obviously, you're going to dive into the friction that's been on the left over the force the vote issue. Plus, obviously, talk about Julian Assange and the update in his case. Great news overall. There's some issues with the news and with the development of him not being extradited to the U.S. That still leaves a little bit of a cause of concern. But overall, good news for Julian Assange that we're going to talk about obviously later in the show. Plus, we're going to break down some fun videos. PragerU, obviously we got to talk about PragerU videos and make fun of them. I also want to play a TMBS documentary on their illicit history episodes. Shout out to TMBS, the Michael Brooks show. Obviously, rest in peace to Michael Brooks. Shout out to David Grisham, Matt Leck, Vic Viana, Forrest Whitaker. I mean, everyone involved with TMBS. Thank you for everything that you do. And I want to play this episode because it was a good episode, and I was watching a ton of the series lately, so I thought, why not play for you guys? But let's get into, obviously, what you guys want me to talk about, which is the whole force the vote issue, how I stand on it, all that fun stuff. Now, obviously, what has transpired yesterday leads us to know some more of the finality to this conversation, this debate, and we can maybe dissect the principles of this debate from both sides, separate from the outcome and the consequences of this outcome and what it means. Because I do believe there's a difference there. Celine in the chat saying Mexico is offering help to Assange. Yes, I saw that. The AMLO administration are offering that. Good to see. Good to see. I did see like a BuzzFeed article, though, saying, spinning it as, how was the headline? It was Julian Assange allowed in the most dangerous country or city in the world. I think it was like a BuzzFeed headline today about Julian Assange. It was crazy. But digressing, back to Nancy Pelosi, the whole force the vote issue. Again, I'm going to tackle the outcome of Nancy Pelosi being reelected and how the squad voted, my thoughts on that, what we should do as the left moving forward, and that's where it kind of connects to the principles of the force the vote debate before we got this congressional vote on Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. But before I give my thoughts and my opinion about it, I think it's only fair that I present both sides as equally as I can about this subject. I do believe they're deserving of that. I respect enough people on both sides of this debate, even though I understand the criticisms of certain actors and certain people within both sides and both camps. I understand that completely. But Breonna Joy Gray, I overall pretty much respect and highly respect in some fashion. And Ben Burgess, I respect as well. I'm going to let them give and present both sides of the equation of the force the vote issue and then give my take on it. Excuse me. First, let's obviously give a shout out to the Katie Halper show. You should all subscribe. Seriously. She does great work and constant content. Like, that's the best part. And there's a few people out there in the left that just get great guests, and she routinely gets amazing guests. So shout out to Katie Halper, always. Breonna Joy Gray, talking a few weeks, obviously, ago about this issue when it first started. And let's run the tape.
So can you tell people about the piece that you wrote, your latest piece, which has been getting so much buzz, as is your want?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll start with the piece that I think is really left out of the conversation, which is this. We have an enormous gulf between what American citizens want from their elected officials with respect to Medicare for all and what those elected officials are willing to offer up. As everyone here on this panel knows, even a Fox News poll said that 72% of Americans support Medicare for all. Almost, 50% approximately goes up and down a little of Republican support Medicare for all. We are in the middle of a global pandemic in which over 14 million people have just lost their health insurance. And we have to start to ask the question, why is it with all of this pressure, which should very naturally lead politicians to want to start running on Medicare for all, they're not doing so? And I think the obvious answer is that there is a multi-million billion-dollar industry geared toward making sure that we stay on a private healthcare system. So the media is obviously complicit in this. It could be that media figures held politicians accountable, that they drew the connection between how much money these individuals were taking from pharmaceutical and private insurance companies. Someone might have flagged the fact that Jim Clyburn takes more money from these industries than anybody else in Congress. And there might be a relationship between that and his support of Joe Biden and the rehabilitation of Joe Biden by the Democratic Party to knock Bernie Sanders out of the race in the 11th inning. But we know that that hasn't happened and is unlikely to happen. So when Jamie Dore surfaced this idea,
I have got an actual plan to get us a vote on Medicare for all in the House of Representatives. What? All that is required to get a vote on Medicare for all in the House of Representatives is for 15 congressional progressives to use their power. Will they? Because America needs Medicare for all right now. Okay? We're in the middle of a pandemic. As people are losing their employment, they also lose their health care. This doesn't happen in any other first world industrial country on the planet. And just so you know, what is happening right now, the government denying you health care in the middle of a pandemic, this is not normal. No matter what they say, this is not acceptable or normal. Congress just gave trillions of dollars to the top billionaires, subsidizing Wall Street's frenzy of profiteering while millions of families are on the financial brink. Not only does America need Medicare for all, America wants Medicare for all. You think I'm kidding? There it is. The solution is one of the most popular policies in the nation. One of the most popular policies of the nation, which is supported by overwhelming majorities of Democratic Party voters and supported by the majority of Republican Party voters. Yet the Democratic Party majority Speaker of the House has never put Medicare for all on the floor for a vote. Who do they really work for? And now, Democrats have nominated Nancy Pelosi to be the Speaker of the House again without a challenge. To win the House speakership, Pelosi needs to secure the majority of the full House. The House votes the first week of January. This is our leverage. Now is our time. It's our time now. I call upon all elected House members, all the members who ran on Medicare for all, and for all the members who are part of the Progressive Caucus in Congress, all the members of the squad. What we need to do now is we need to work together as a movement. What do we need? We need 15 Democrats. That's all we need. 15 Democrats to tell Nancy Pelosi that you will not vote for her as Speaker unless Medicare for all is put on the House floor for a vote. That's it. It's really that simple. Now is the time for progressives to exercise their power, play hardball, and use their power for the benefit of their constituents. Pramila Jayapal's Medicare for All legislation, House Resolution 1384. I want you to tell Nancy Pelosi to put that legislation on the floor for a vote. Make Pelosi promise on video, in writing, or in public that she's going to do that. No vote for Nancy Pelosi unless Medicare for All is put on the House floor for a vote. There's nearly 100 members of the Progressive Caucus. There's 100 members. Look at this. We only need 15 members to pull this off. 15 members withholding their vote for Nancy Pelosi will show that progressives are willing to exert power to help the people.
So when Jimmy Dore surfaced this idea, and it naturally caught fire in a really organic way, and galvanized people, made a lot of people on the left feel hopeful, and like there was a fight still to be had that could advance our interest. I thought it was a really good idea, largely because in the absence of any other strategy to force the media to pay attention to that enormous chasm between where Americans are and where their politicians are, I think this is an opportunity that's too good to exploit. And we're not going to have it again. This pandemic is obviously horrible. I think today is like the highest death toll that we've ever had. But if there could be any silver lining out of this, it should be that it has laid bare the vulnerabilities in our healthcare system. Our political leadership has admitted, it has acknowledged that healthcare should be free for COVID sufferers. And there is a real slippery slope between that and acknowledging that healthcare should be free at point of service for all. And you saw how vulnerable they are there when I simply quote tweeted Kamala Harris in the spring saying, free healthcare for COVID is a good start, but what if someone is dying of cancer or diabetes and the entire internet collapsed? They know there's a vulnerability there, and I think this is an amazing opportunity to exploit it, not just because of the pandemic, but also because Nancy Pelosi is someone who is one of the most unpopular politicians in America. Her popularity rating is worse than Trump, and the fact of Nancy Pelosi being the linchpin in all of this is guaranteed to draw a certain amount of media attention, if only from the right, who will relish the idea of her being bent over the proverbial barrel.
Fun.
Yeah. How did you kind of come to the position you came to?
Well, I am as aware as anyone of how Jimmy Dore is perceived. I've had my own little dust-ups with him in the past. But the thing is, I was listening to the counter arguments and none of them were substantive. I mean, it was all, I don't like Jimmy Dore, which is fine. There's plenty of reasons that people have to feel that way. But what I'm attuned to, what I used to pay attention to as, a comms person was, what the response was when you're selling certain kinds of things, when you're pitching certain kinds of things. And, I'm not saying I'm some expert. I'm not Bernie Sanders who's been going to rooms and talking to people for 40 years, but I did have experiences on my campaign of feeling what sunk and what landed in terms of a pitch. And when you see a natural groundswell of enthusiasm around an idea, I don't think that one's first instinct should be to poo-poo it or say, this isn't the idea I would have chosen, this isn't the best potential strategy. If there are other positive things to ask for, other useful things to ask for, I think we should make those demands as well. I think that David Sirota is right to have pointed to some of the more wonky things that, the Jimmy Dores and the Mees of the world aren't going to come up with. And those things can be used in tandem with the floor vote. But I think that there are particular aspects of the floor vote that you can call them performative, you could call it theater, but I call it effective in galvanizing the kind of grassroots movement that would be necessary to really press this issue home. So yes, as I say in my article, you also would need, and I would hope that the progressive members of Congress, if they were to pursue this option, would reach out and try to galvanize support among labor and other activist groups, including Black Lives Matter, who we all know managed to galvanize millions of people in the street this summer, and who have as part of their platform universal health care.
Now let's go to Ben Burgess over at Jacobin and his own show. give them an argument. I think that's the name of his show. Again, I'm gonna get into both after Ben says the other side, because there's a lot of things within what Brianna said and what Jimmy Dore said that I want to address, and there's stuff within what Ben's about to say that I want to address as well. So I'll just say it for the end.
During the pandemic, we need Medicare for all more desperately than ever. It's criminal that the Democratic leadership continues to oppose it. Everyone on the left agrees with that. But to understand how the Democratic and Republican establishments can succeed in continuing to block such a basic reform, we need to avoid the dangers of voluntarism, the idea that we can achieve important political results by just wanting them badly enough. It's vitally important that we win this fight, but to do that, we need to start with a realistic understanding of why we're losing. Nancy Pelosi has been reelected as Speaker of the House. I'd say that it had all the suspense of a Soviet election, but honestly, there was probably more factional wrangling within the Brezhnev-era power structure than at the top levels of the contemporary Democratic Party. Anyone on the left should be able to agree that Nancy Pelosi continuing to exercise any sort of power is a bad thing. But comedian and YouTube host Jimmy Dore has suggested that all of this reflects particularly badly on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that AOC should have taken the leadership vote as an opportunity to exercise some sort of leverage in a way that would advance the cause of Medicare for all. How's that work? Well, his argument is that she should have taken a tough negotiating position, demanding that Pelosi agree to schedule a vote on Medicare for all in the House of Representatives as a condition of supporting her re-election to the speakership. To hear some of Jimmy's most intense online supporters, you'd think that if AOC had done this, the result would be that Medicare for all would become law. You'd think that after years of being one of the highest profile champions of Medicare for all on the national stage, AOC was revealing herself as a hypocrite and a sellout at just the moment when she had a chance to make it a reality. Now, to be fair to Jimmy Dore, I don't think even he thinks that things would have played out that way. He knows it wouldn't have had the votes to pass even the House, never mind a Senate that will most likely be controlled by the GOP. His idea is this. There are currently well over 100 congressional co-sponsors of the Medicare for All bill. At least some of these people probably aren't serious about it. They're co-sponsoring to shore up their progressive credentials, but push came to shove, they wouldn't actually vote for it. So he thinks that having a vote would be a useful test. We'd see who was really supporting giving health care to their desperate constituents and who would ultimately side with the insurance industry. Once the battle lines were drawn, we'd know who to target. His premise is almost certainly right in some cases. I'm sure there are at least some congressional Democrats who are ready to make the gesture of symbolically supporting an important reform, but would think twice about enraging the donor class. But his idea for finding out who these people are collapses the second we start to think about it. Let's assume for the sake of argument that AOC has enough leverage to force Pelosi to allow a vote on Medicare for all. She almost certainly does not have that kind of leverage, because why would she? It's not as if Pelosi was in a close leadership race where she desperately needed the votes of a few leftists. But whatever, let's pretend she did. When that vote happened, why would anyone who was co-sponsoring it vote against it? Assuming that these insincere co-sponsors can do basic arithmetic, they know it was perfectly safe to vote for it, because if literally every single co-sponsor voted for it, and they somehow conjured up another 100 votes out of thin air, it would still be defeated in the House. And that's not even mentioning the existence of the Senate, or a president-elect who openly said on the campaign trail that if it did somehow pass both houses, he'd veto it. So why the hell wouldn't anyone willing to symbolically co-sponsor Medicare for All, thinking it wouldn't go anywhere, also cast a symbolic vote for Medicare for All, again, knowing that it wouldn't go anywhere? This idea makes no sense. So why are so many people in Dora's audience so willing to believe it? and to denounce one of the only real solid social democrats in the House over this. The underlying disease is voluntarism, the idea that we can will important political outcomes into existence. Put a different way, voluntarism is the idea that anything is possible, regardless of the political terrain we're fighting on. And if anything is always possible, then only personal motivations explain why things happen the way they happen. Voluntarists attribute failures and losses not to larger structural factors, but to the losers having not fought hard enough to win in the first place. Rather than assessing the circumstances in which actors must make tough choices, they're instead considered to be sellouts and hypocrites. Think about the kind of leftists, they exist, I've met some, who think that Evo Morales must be a sellout because the Bolivian capitalist class wasn't expropriated during his tenure as president. Never mind that cutting off one tiny developing nation from the world economy would have been a humanitarian disaster, very quickly followed by a political disaster. Now, of course, there are moments when a particular individual does have a unique amount of leverage over the course of history. If Vladimir Lenin didn't return to Petrograd in October 1917, one could reasonably argue that the Bolshevik Revolution wouldn't have happened, and the 20th century would have looked very different. Similarly, while the American president is surely constrained in many respects, he has a far greater ability to dramatically change the course of human existence through his political choices than nearly any other actor. But these examples aren't voluntarism precisely because, in both cases, the institutional and structural factors in their particular context enable greater individual impact. For a single modern congresswoman, that's just not the case. Voluntarism needs to be resisted, not primarily because it's unkind or uncharitable to the leaders castigated for allegedly not wanting good outcomes badly enough, but much more importantly because it blocks us from seeing things clearly so we can start to think about what strategy could actually lead us to victory. Maybe AOC should have refused to vote for Pelosi rather than extracting whatever tiny concessions she may have been able to get from her thoroughly lousy bargaining position. Her refusing to vote for Pelosi wouldn't have achieved anything concretely, but at least it would have been mildly ideologically clarifying for anyone who happened to be paying attention. That's not nothing, but symbolic victories alone should not be even our acceptable minimum. And whatever you think about that issue, let's get the big picture clear. The reason Medicare for All isn't going to become a reality in the next session of Congress or the one after that is not that the very few leftists in that institution don't want it badly enough. It's that the current balance of forces is extraordinarily unfavorable to the left. The American business elites have enormous wealth and enormous power, and we lack both a vibrant, militant American labor movement and political institutions like a workers' party or trade union confederations to multiply the strength of average working people. You might think that that sounds like an absurdly massive mountain to climb, but it's literally the only way anyone around the world has ever won these things in the past. In other words, the only solution is to do the long, slow, frustrating work of building a movement that can completely change the composition of Congress and organize at the base of society to overcome inevitable ruling class resistance to important reforms. There is no one neat trick that substitutes for organizing the working class and achieving power. Voluntarism is dangerous for the same reason that it's dangerous to swim in a riptide and assume that you won't drown if you just paddle hard enough. We need to be real about what's actually stopping us from achieving our goals if the serious left is ever going to be anything but a pointless sideshow.
Now, there's a lot to this debate that I think is not really worthwhile of discussion. Like when it comes to like Jimmy Dore and his personality, I tend not to care. I don't like Jimmy Dore. I think he doesn't do enough research into many topics. But besides the point, it doesn't matter to me that like Jimmy's involved. Like I don't care. Like Nico House, I don't like. I think he's a grifter. But like that's beside the point in some fashion. Like I don't I see a lot of, before I get into like the actual meat, the meat of the discussion and the debate between these two sides, I want to point out that there's been a lot of accusations on both sides about either being opportunist, reformist, whatever sort of adjective you want to use, and on the other side being reactionaries and being grifters, right? And there are 100% reactionaries on some sides. You have opportunists on some sides. You have reformists on some sides that are not truly anti-capital and anti-imperialist. Like, of course, we're going to have people involved on both spectrums of this leftist debate that are not serious, good faith actors in this discussion. We're involved with so many different media outlets and consultation firms, so to speak. You're going to get into people that do not have good intentions, of course. But that's besides the point in some fashion, because there are people on both sides that I do respect. And again, there's an element to this discussion that is completely separate from the Nancy Pelosi Medicare for All side to it. But first, let me address that point, the Nancy Pelosi vote and the Medicare for All floor vote that was to be forced or wanted to be forced. One, I don't think we could have ever got that forced floor vote. I think even in the best case scenario of like the 7 or 8 or 9 people, how many people we want to put into the squad, if they all said, no, we're not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi, they had enough votes in that category, so to speak, to stop her from getting a majority in Congress and stop her from being Speaker of the House. But it would have gone to a second round, and a third round, and a fourth round if need be. And I think any serious person in politics understands that Nancy Pelosi at some point would have got enough votes irregardless of the squad. So I feel like that needs to be stated. But let's table that, because we're done with that point. Now, the idea of Medicare for all, can that actually be gained in the system? I think Ben Burr just described it perfectly on why it is unlikely that we are to get Medicare for all actually passed this way. It is purely symbolic, purely performative, and that might be fine sometimes. Like performative wins and symbolic wins for morale boosters, I understand that sentiment. When we talk about the actual sort of principles of the argument, we can get into that later. But the actual material reality of what happened and what is happening is that Medicare for all cannot be passed this way. So let's stop acting like that's even a potentiality here in this equation, in this scenario. It's not happening. Whether we want to debate about symbolic victories and whether in this scenario it's worth it, we can talk about that. We can discuss that. I think that is a better discussion. On top of it, as we know now, right, because both of these videos were done before we got the actual Speaker of the House vote, the entire squad, however many people we want to put into that group, it's run around, 10 people, give or take, they unanimously voted for Nancy Pelosi. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them did have campaign promises and stated on the record at certain times that they wouldn't vote for Nancy Pelosi. And the fact that they did is shameful. I think that deserves to be criticized. I think that the idea that they should be shielded from criticism for that for breaking campaign promises it just doesn't make sense to me. That's not how politics works. However, when it comes back to thinking that something's going to happen that isn't reality based, we knew heading into this that most of the squad, if not all of them, especially those that have already been in positions of power in Congress, not the ones that have just been elected, they've already cozied up to Nancy Pelosi and the establishment. Right? And this is where we get into the principles of the matter. At this level, if you are in Congress, at the very best, you are a reformist. At the very best, you're a social democrat. That means you're still pro-capitalism. You don't want to reform it, clean up the edges a little bit, right? But you're still pro-capitalism. You're not even necessarily anti-imperialist. So we have to be realistic about what the squad is, what power they really have, and what they want to achieve comparative to us, right? And how they want to achieve that. The strategy and tactics they go about that is different than communists, anarchists, from whatever. And I think that we can't get lost in that reality. That sometimes we do. Sometimes we put a lot of our hope in these few figures at the very top. And that is a ahistorical, that is a almost naive approach to think about this political fight we're in. And that's where I kind of slip into more of the Ben Burgess, more of the anti-force the vote crowd, because I think they're absolutely right when it comes to this principle, that these type of symbolic battles are not really worth our time and energy. Why? Because they don't achieve material gains for the working class in any fashion. The idea that they really, in this specific case, that they add primary fodder, the more I've thought about it over the weeks, the more I think that's not reality-based, because, let's be honest, most people want Medicare for all already. We know that. But the president of the country, or the president-elect of the country, like Ben Burgess said, is on record stating that he would veto Medicare for all if it somehow passed the House and the Senate. So it's not necessarily a wedge issue at this point, unfortunately. And the idea that would separate, the wheat from the chaff in primaries in, Congress and elections for 2022 is purely speculative. And I don't have much faith in that, to be honest. That is going to be some massive wedge issue that we can even get these people that are fake symbolically supportive of Medicare for all to actually be true to their donor class and their overall class. I don't really believe that's possible, that would even achieve any real gains, to be quite honest. So we come back down to these different types of fighting, and the force the vote issue is a top-down way to fight for change, and I think that is getting way ahead of ourselves in terms of our power dynamic as the left. Okay? One, we don't really even have that many people in Congress that are leftists, air quotes, leftists, right? We don't have that many. It's maybe 10. It's maybe 12. It's not that many. I can only think of, 2 people in the Senate that I would even consider to be leftists. And we have maybe 7 or 8, if, again, we're including social democracy and under the left, they amount to that. So we're talking about 10, 12 people. So the power dynamic is not there from the top to bottom structure to where we can actually affect change at the very top, to where it would, where we can change federal law and regulation and policy and institutions. We can't do that. We can't change the structural form at the very top. So how do we actually change that? We need a bottom-up structure of change. How do we do that? Is through labor militancy. Okay? How do we get the New Deal economics, the Keynesian setup that we had that lasted for roughly, 40 years until the 70s, that protected workers, that focused the entire economy on full employment instead of protecting banks and the financial institutions, right? So how did we get there? It wasn't a top-down reformist change. It wasn't FDR being the saint, the next Jesus Christ, and deciding, I'm going to just help everyone in the Great Depression out. No. Okay? We had the CIO aggressively, and other trade unions and confederations heavily push the government and the economy in their direction. How? Through massive strikes, shutting down the economy, blowing up factories, shit like that. okay? The Socialist Party, the Communist Party, we had a thrivant leftist party organizational structures on both sides of the paradigm in terms of socialists and communists, and they were militant. They were heavily involved in the labor movement. And there was this tandem, this combination, this intertwining of power and institutions between the leftist political organizations and the leftist labor organizations. Okay? And systematically, over the last 80 years, give or take, they have been systematically broken down and dismantled through neoliberal globalization, through many different steps on how the U.S. government dismantled unions, broke them apart, and ultimately destroyed leftist political organizations as well. So we have to understand where we're starting at, okay, and what we need to do to get to even a position to start changing the political and economic paradigm. Okay, we want to talk about primarying out all these establishment Dems. We need a thriving militant left, both in labor and in political organizations. And they need to be working in tandem together. That's not happening right now. Okay? We need to rebuild our labor movement. That is the foundation of any successful leftist movement in the world in history. It is. There's no way we can circumvent that. I'm sorry. Okay? So, until we have that, these symbolic debates and battles seem like a waste of energy, to be honest. Both as for us, as we're debating each other and fighting tooth and nail against each other, just a waste of energy and time, and it's burning bridges when it shouldn't. And on top of it, it isn't the battle we should be fighting. It isn't the battle or even the terrain that we should be on right now. Congress should be almost an afterthought in terms of what they do there. Okay? Because the very few leftists we have in Congress are so ineffective when it comes to their power dynamic that they can't do anything, even if they really tried. And if they tried, then I guess they'd be better leftists, but it wouldn't get us anywhere. That's the reality. We can shit on AOC and the squad all we want and say they're not true revolutionaries, because they're not, and we know that already. But the reality is that how we want change is not going to come from begging at a couple people in Congress for change. We need the capitalist class to fear us. They don't. Why? Because they have dismantled our strength, our foundation, our roots. So we need to rebuild those. Before we even talk about how we angle and measure policy to get passed in Congress. Even if we get to a point where we have a strong, thriving, militant labor movement again, do we even talk about electoralism as a primary strategy still? We shouldn't. It's not. It's not the primary strategy we should have. Anyways, that's overall my thoughts on the force to vote issue. I think that it's been a giant waste of energy and resources for the left. I think that overall, most people understand what we need to be doing, like what the foundational work needs to be done. And most of us are choosing not to for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's due to COVID and you're not wanting to go out and organize right now. Maybe it's due to whatever. Okay? I'll give people benefit of the doubt. But the reality is that we're not reviving our labor movement at this second. We're bickering online on Twitter about media personalities and which one's a grifter. Like, who fucking cares? Like, imagine talking to a normie, right, about this, when they just want better wages, they want less bills, they want possibly, if they're really inclined to politics, they don't want their taxpayer dollars to go towards wars overseas. They want them to go towards schools and hospitals and shit like that. That's what we're talking about here. And how do you galvanize them? You have to start in the workplace. start at the labor force. Once we have worker strength and power, then we can get real concessions. Then we can really quickly, efficiently primary out these establishment Democrats. But right now, that's not the setup. Right now, we're a few steps behind really being at this position to talk about forcing establishment Democratic hands. And let's be honest, are we really believing the establishment Democratic Party and the Republican Party wouldn't coalesce to beat down 7 lefties in Congress? Like, come on here. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves at all. Moving on. Let's talk about Julian Assange not facing extradition to the U.S. For the sake of time, I did a 2-hour show earlier today, so I'm not going to dwell on this for too long. This is good news. The UK judge refuses U.S. extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. The judge did agree on the merit of most of the case, though, and that's where it's a little bit of a concern here, where in sort of a repeal, retrial, whatever, I don't know what the terminology in the UK is per se, in a repeal by the U.S. in trying to extradite Assange, with the reason the judge used to stop this extradition, which was Assange's mental health. The judge believed that he was at suicide risk if he was to be extradited. That was the only reason he refused this order from the U.S. federal government. So, if in 4 months' time, if the judge decides, or a new judge decides, hey, you know what? I think he's perfectly mentally fit to go travel. And the first judge already agreed with the merits of the case, so he's going. So we're at some concern here. I do believe, though, I did not confirm this, though. I apologize. I should confirm this, that the judge said that bail was potential for Julian Assange, which would obviously allow him to get out to Mexico or any other country that obviously would offer him asylum. Obviously, we know that Mexico just offered it today, but let's see where it goes. Hopefully, Julian Assange gets the fuck out of Dodge, man. That's all I can pray and hope for. Random nobody in the chat saying the ruling is good, the reasoning is bad. Yeah, absolutely. Like, we got at the very, very least, we got Assange's life protected a while longer. Because I think another report came out, I forget who reported it, maybe random nobody can remember what outlet reported this, that like recently, it was proof that came out that the U.S. secret agents, CIA, whatever, tried to assassinate Julian Assange again. And it's just, man, gotta be worried, man. This guy has helped expose so many crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity by our state and others around the world. Has he been used by reactionary forces? Of course. Of course. There's always reactionary revolutionary forces, just as there are radical revolutionary forces. And when you're exposing the crimes of the current status quo, of course the reactionary side can use that as well. But so can we. So it just doesn't make sense. I would never understand. Even like I see people on the left not really defend Julian Assange, and that just doesn't make sense to me. Like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, what we know about the Iraq War or war crimes in the Middle East, it's all due to this man in some fashion. Or at least in connection to this man and other people involved. But he was a central figure to that. Moving on. Let's watch this PragerU video and make fun of it. Capitalism versus Socialism is the name of this video. And I remember the last one I watched, I think it was the last show I did. I think it was like how the left views like power, race, and class, I think. Something to that effect. And that was That was like aneurysm inducing, to be quite honest. That was the worst shit I've ever watched in my life. Jonathan Kidder in the chat saying that's a rarity for the left to recognize these people. These people being who? Jonathan, are you talking about Snowden and Manning and Julian Assange? Is that who you're talking about? Curious. But let's watch this PragerU video and make fun of it.
Capitalism versus socialism. We can sum up each economic system in one line. Capitalism is based on human greed. Socialism is based on human need, right? No.
I know he's about to say no, but Jesus Christ, he got it. Like, dude, we're not even like 13 seconds into the video. They fucking got it. Jesus fucking Christ. That's amazing. Jonathan Kidder saying Assange, Snowden, yes. I think obviously like the liberal, neoliberal side of politics, the Democratic Party, obviously, and the constituents who are mostly neoliberals, they don't mention Julian Assange and Snowden that much because of Trump's co-opting of WikiLeaks and the like. But if for anyone that remembers back in the day, all of this stuff came out like first in like the Bush years and then Obama. So the left, who didn't like Bush and didn't like Obama, we talked about Edward Snowden and Julian Assange a lot back in the day. And I do think that there has been a decline even within the left to a small degree since Trump. I think that's obviously due to Trump trying to co-opt WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and the such. But I would say this, that there's a lot of people in the left that do talk about Julian Assange and do talk about Edward Snowden and Jonathan. The like MSNBC crowd, no, because Trump was able to use Julian Assange and WikiLeaks to his advantage. Even though the left have been using WikiLeaks against presidential administrations for a while now. So it's a weird paradigm we're in right now with how the center left, the liberal side of politics view Julian Assange and how they cover him, which is the vast mainstream conglomerates. We see MSNBC, CNN, who else? We talk about NBC, right? Like, I don't know. Most where we have this in this conversation. But of course, they don't talk about Assange in any significant category because they're adherents to the capitalist class. And the capitalist class doesn't like Julian Assange because he sheds light to the war crimes that they commit. You know? Obviously, MSNBC isn't owned by them anymore, but MSNBC used to be owned by, I think it was General Electric. And General Electric, obviously, a massive armament company. Even though they do other electronic appliances and stuff, they also build fucking bombs and tanks. So MSNBC was notoriously pro-Iraq war, except for like one host, and they fired him. So, anyways, I was rambling there, Jonathan. You're right. If you're especially talking about the like center left, like liberal, like MSNBC crowd, they don't talk about Julian Assange at all. Back to PragerU getting this all right with capitalism is based on greed and socialism is based on human need. I love it. Let's see how they spin it.
No, wrong, so wrong. It's exactly backwards. And I'll prove it to you. Been on Amazon lately? Each of the thousands of products Amazon offers represents the work of people who believe they have something you want or need. If they're right, they prosper. If they're wrong, they don't. That's how the free market works. It encourages people to improve their lives by satisfying the needs of others. No one starts.
The best part is that like it's back to back. Like, wow, like how are you even doing this? Because one, you accurately, I mean, for like even children, I think you described the difference between capitalism and socialism. One's based on greed, one's based on need, quite well. I mean, obviously the Karl Marx quote, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, is a seminal, foundational quote, so to speak, of Marxism, socialism, communism, and the like. But then your defense of how capitalism isn't greedy is Amazon, which has the richest man in the world owning it, using FBI or NSA agencies to spy on his own employees and break up unions. The same guy that's making billions and became a trillionaire while millions of people became unemployed, while his own workers had to like pee in bottles and shit in order to make quotas. Yeah, that's the example you want to use for how capitalism isn't greedy? Really? Because people sell products on there that people need? People will still like buy things they need or accumulate, let's say. Let's use that word, that capitalistic term, right? Accumulate things they need in even socialist societies. But it's not based on greed. It's not based on an economic setup that's severely undemocratic. You can have a massive workforce that designs things and gets products out, that's a variety of products out to consumers, right? That is collectively fucking owned. Where the setup of the company is not a top-down setup. It's a bottom-to-top setup. It's called worker co-ops. So, it's so sad that they get people with this shit. It really is. Because it's so on its surface, just like easy to pick apart.
Parts of business making a thing or providing a service for themselves. They start a business to make things or provide services for others. Now, I speak from personal experience. When I was the CEO of the company that owns Carl's Jr. and Hardee's restaurant chains, we spent
I get now.
millions of dollars every year trying to determine what customers wanted. If our customers didn't like something, we changed it, and fast. Because if we didn't, our competitors would, pun intended, eat us for lunch. The consumer, that's you, has the ultimate power. In effect, you vote with every dollar you spend. In a socialist economy, the government
You do not have free choice, even in like our peak consumerism in the U.S., right? I believe the term is called food deserts, or I believe it's called food deserts is the term. You can look it up. Basically to the effect that if you're using like produce and that content, right? What you can buy, since this guy is talking about food, that the options of food items are largely multinational corporations, huge conglomerates, and it's a select few in any geographic area. So you don't have like freedom of choice. You have a very limited choice, and that choice is often unhealthy food. Okay. On top of it, okay, this country and capitalism as a whole wastes tons of food. I forget the amount of food we waste as a country. It's ginormous. Okay. Why is that food not given to the homeless or people that are the millions of people that are out there stating that we don't have enough money to buy food, and we're concerned about how we're going to pay for the next meal or buy the next set of groceries. All right? Why isn't that food given to people or given to them at a lower price? Because of profit. That company will make more money not selling that produce undervalue, or give it away, or whatever it may be. So, therefore, they'll just throw it away. That's not going to make them a profit. Capitalism is built on profit. Profit is the surplus wealth generated from your labor, right? So if you're a CEO of a company and you take phone calls all day, well, you have 1,000 employees or 100 employees, and they're actually working in the factory, and then you pay them $7 an hour, well, you make millions. You're extrapolating the surplus value from their labor. Why do you do that? Because the setup is designed to where you're at the very, very top. Okay? We never got rid of lords and dukes and kings and queens. We just call them CEOs now. That's the difference. We just call them CEOs. Okay? When you go and drive past a Walmart, view that as a feudal castle. Because that's, in a similar way, the economic paradigm of servitude the rest of the surrounding populace and workforce has to be under. Okay? Let's continue this video. And also, socialist economy, I don't know how they're going to describe it, but socialism is not just when the government does stuff. Having a planned economy in siege socialist countries is obviously a Marxist-Leninist philosophy and a Maoist philosophy, of course, but regardless, that's like a very, very small understanding of how socialist economies work.
Has the ultimate power. It decides what you get
people.
from a limited supply it decides should exist. Instead of millions of people making millions of decisions about what they want, a few people, government elites, decide what people should have and how much they should pay for it. Not surprisingly, they always get it wrong. Have you ever noticed that late-stage socialist failures always run out of essential items like toilet paper? Of course, this isn't a problem for those who have
Late-stage socialist countries? Are we talking about like the Soviet Union in the 80s? Or like the Eastern Bloc? Like what? The countries that set up massive free market reforms in the 80s and 90s, which completely tanked the economy to the point where the people that are still alive to this day, that were alive during the Soviet Union, especially during Stalin era, they prefer to go back to that era. Okay? I forget the numbers. I think it's like 60% of people that lived like under Stalin or lived under the Soviet Union rather have their country be a communist country again. Like, that's the funniest fucking part to me, man. Like, what failed those countries, what brought them to their heels in the 90s was the neoliberal globalization that overthrew communism and sieged socialism in the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union. So, like, what? And then you have countries like Cuba, who's been a siege socialist country. And what I mean by siege socialist, maybe people listening, like maybe Jonathan, I don't know, Jonathan, how well-versed you are on theory. Siege socialism is the concept of, let's say you have a socialist revolution happens, right? But their country is obviously literally and economically, like militarily, economically, politically under siege from outside capitalist forces, whether it's literally like Russia, and for Russia's example, the Soviet Union, they were invaded by 14 countries during the Russian Civil War after the Russian Revolution. And obviously you have the economic persecution that happens, and you get that through institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. They're all, in effect, force neoliberal restructuring, which ends up crashing countries like South Korea, Mexico, Argentina, Thailand, Malaysia. This all happened like in the 80s and 90s. So it's crazy. Jonathan Kidder saying people still cry themselves to sleep under pictures of Mao Zedong. Well, yeah, I mean, look, there's issues with Mao and Communist China, and obviously when you get like Deng Xiaoping in the 80s, who succeeded Mao Zedong, who opened up China to market reforms and neoliberal reforms, and that's a separate issue than Mao per se. But Mao did turn China from a backwards, and I mean that in the worst sense, a backwards, divided country. I mean, you have to understand that at the point of the Chinese Revolution, you had the Kuomintang government, which was a heavily nationalistic, and depending who was in charge at the time, either leaned fascist or leaned, let's say, center left. But at the time, most of the country was under warlords. Like there was like local generals and warlords running around, killing people. We had the land-owning class basically buying up private armies and persecuting the peasantry. It was an extremely violent time. Like imagine medieval Europe, but you have guns, and it's 1920s China, right? So Mao being able to turn that country into a unified country that uplifted, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, taught them how to read, gave them health care. Like he killed all the landlord class. That's true. Yeah, there was massive famines that killed millions of people, and he tried to hide that up. Yep. And some of those massive famines, by the way, were the result of that economic siege that I talk about. Same with the Soviet Union and their famines. I believe that if you want to look up, especially with the Soviet Union, it's the Golden Blockade. I believe you want to look that up, where they has to do with like grain ownership and how Russia could buy for supplies and farming equipment. It's crazy. But, there's a reason why those revolutionaries of the 20th century, people still love. People still idolize in some fashion. Because they see them as liberators from a previous paradigm that is absolutely awful. But back to the PragerU video, when they're talking about like late stage socialism, first of all, I don't even know what that means, and how it can't provide the necessities for people. How can they explain Cuba? Again, that's been under siege by either economic or military embargo for decades, for 70 years, right? How do they have better life expectancy than we do? Why? Because their needs are met better than ours. That's why. How can they read better than we can? Because their needs are met more than ours. Why? Because of their state planning. That's a reality. And the Cuban system is the same exact system as the Soviet Union. One just ultimately fell due to counter-revolutionary movements. Like look up Yeltsin, what's his name? Boris Yeltsin, right, from the 90s, who was like the president, air quotes, president of Russia in the 90s. He literally drove tanks to Russia's, like, I forget what the actual name of their Congress is, right? And killed like hundreds, if not thousands of people, and like ruthlessly took over the government. What did Clinton do? Sign massive trade deals with them. Why? Because he opened up the country to foreign investment. That's where we get the whole Catastroika event where all of these nationalized, and in a sense, unionized industries were all of a sudden privatized and workforces laid off. It's insanity. So, what are they going to talk about here? It's going to be bullshit.
The right connections with the right people. Those chosen few get whatever they want, but everyone else is out of luck. Venezuela, once the
That is literally capitalism.
richest country in South America, is the most recent example of socialism driving a prosperous country into an economic ditch.
Are they going to talk about the economic embargoes and sanctions, the literal blockade of U.S. warships? No.
Maybe you think it's an unfair example. I'm not sure why, but okay. We'll ignore the fact that leftist activists celebrated it as a great socialist success right up until it wasn't. But what about Western European countries? Don't they have socialist economies? People seem pretty happy there. Why can't we have what they have? Free healthcare, free college, stronger unions. Good question, and the answer may surprise you.
Honestly, like functionally speaking, Venezuela and Bolivia are social democratic states, just like the Nordic countries. The difference is those Nordic countries aren't imperially oppressed by the global empire, which is the U.S. Okay, they're not facing economic embargoes and sanctions by the U.S., the UN, the IMF, whatever it may be. That's the reality. Why don't they face those embargoes? Because of their military manufacturers that obviously give supplies to the military-industrial complex, so therefore they're fine. You know, the limited, obviously, amount of private ownership that they allow in the Nordic model is roughly similar to the amount of private ownership allowed in Venezuela, in Bolivia. I'm trying to think of like another country. It's probably the best two examples because Cuba's not. Cuba is a very different model. So I don't know where he's going with this. Again, just all over the place, just wrong. Just factually, empirically wrong by the former Carl's Jr. CEO. Shocker. Maybe they shouldn't get a CEO to talk about what capitalism or socialism is. Maybe they should get an academic. But then again, it's PragerU. It's a literal propagandist outlet for capitalism. So, of course, they wouldn't.
There are no socialist countries in Western Europe. Most are just as capitalist as the United States.
That's not true.
The only difference, and it's a big one, is that they offer more government benefits than the U.S. does. We can argue about the cost of these benefits and the point at which they reduce individual initiative, thus doing more harm than good. Scandinavians have been debating those questions for years. But only a free market capitalist economy can produce the wealth necessary to sustain all of the supposedly free stuff Europeans enjoy. To get the free stuff, after all, you have to create enough wealth to generate enough tax revenue to pay for everything the government gives away. Without capitalism, you're Venezuela. In a 2015 speech at Harvard, Denmark's prime minister took great pains to make this point. I know that some people in the U.S. associate the Nordic model with socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. So
For those who are listening, I encourage you to look up the name Olaf Palme or Plume. I think it's pronounced Palm. I think it was the Swedish prime minister, not the Danish one. Denmark has always been a little more conservative in their economic paradigm comparative to, obviously, Norway and Sweden, but Finland as well. So I encourage people to do that. 'Cause I'm not going to get into it right now, but when we talk about the overthrow of communism in the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union, and even to a sense China as well, and some aspects, even Cuba. Cuba has opened up more free market reforms in a sense to try to get around economic embargoes, and it's not ultimately been the most successful. But regardless, the paradigm of socialism being overthrown in the 80s and 90s in the Eastern Bloc and Russia happened in the Nordic model as well. The Nordic model we see today is not the same Nordic model that produced the paradigm that allowed Sweden, Norway, and Denmark and Finland to thrive the way that they are. Celine in the chat saying they're just trying to find an excuse not to help people. Exactly. Capitalism is going to fall eventually. I absolutely, like any paradigm of human history when it comes to like political and economic organization, it's finite. We've never had a political and economic system that has survived in eternity since, or at least since, obviously human civilization has been around. We've had the age of feudalism die. We've had even like the pre-feudalist societies that were, completely top-down absolute monarchies, without sort of the feudal interjectory lords, right? They went away in some fashion. They evolved, right? Like we talk about as Marxists and communists and socialists that when we have that actual paradigm shifting series of events that leads to the capitalistic order in the world to be thrown away, that next model is going to feature some aspects of the old model. I believe it was Engels or Marx said that, the new society is going to have the birthmarks of the old society, right? Similar to how capitalism has birthmarks to the feudal system that predated it. So it's quite intriguing when we talk about how is socialism made up today in our actual material world in the countries that we can look at and analyze. How can it look? What sort of makeup is it going to have that's going to feature some of the old model? Because it's going to by default. It won't be till the next generation after that can truly, achieve that higher stage communism. I definitely agree with Lenin on that, at least, that the post-revolutionary society is a lower form of communism. It's a lower form of socialism. So, anyways, random Noba in the chat saying the capitalists kill, often literally, all the socialist countries. It's not complicated. No, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Let's continue this. It's almost done. See how, any more bullshit they say.
When you point to Denmark as a paragon of socialism, you're really singing the praises of capitalism. The more capitalism, the less socialism you need. Look at America since 2017. A policy of lower taxes and less government regulation, that's more capitalism, has led to a robust economic expansion, something thought impossible just a few years earlier. Unemployment, notably among minority groups, typically most at risk for poverty, is at a generational low. Economic expansion gets people off welfare and into work. That's less socialism. None of this requires a degree in economics. Common sense is all you need. That's why it's so frustrating to see young people praising socialism and criticizing capitalism. It's bad enough that they're working against their own interests, better job prospects, better wages, personal freedom. But they're also working against the interest of the less fortunate.
Yeah, the freedom you have to like go work at whatever company you want is the same freedom of CEOs to rip you off. Right? Like, I forget what theorist it was. I was reading the David Harvey book, and he was mentioning this person. I forget the name of this person, talking about positive and negative freedoms, and how in a capitalist society, when you get the positive freedoms, you by default get negative freedoms. You know, the freedom of the state to form NSA. You know, the freedom of corporations to take their capital and move it to another country with cheaper labor. You know, yeah, you have a freedom to go to another company if you want, but guess what? They have the same freedom to take their operation, their production, into a cheaper market, a non-union market. You know? You never hear about those freedoms from capitalists. Of course not.
Capitalism leads to economic democracy. Socialism leads to the economic dictatorship of the elite. Always and everywhere.
Oh my God.
So beware what you ask for. You just might get it. I'm Andy Puzder, the author of The Capitalist Comeback for Prager University.
That was just so stupid. The best part is how often they describe socialism, and it's just capitalism. You know? Like, it's amazing. It's quite impressive. Last video of the day, and then we're going to head out over, guys. We're going to watch the TMBS illicit history video on Thomas Sankara. It was, I believe, his birthday recently, and just the other day, I think it was yesterday, was the anniversary of the Haitian Revolution. I think 17th anniversary of the Haitian Revolution. So I thought, why not celebrate another revolutionary African in Thomas Sankara, who also, I believe his birthday was recently as well. And I think this documentary is great stuff. Milton Al-Alamadi narrates it, obviously produced by Michael Brooks, rest in peace. Vic Viana, Forrest Whitaker, and who else? I think somebody else produces it too. I don't know if David Grisham and Matt Leck are intimately involved with the production of these videos, but if they are, obviously shout out to them as well. Let's play it.
Produit suffisamment de quoi nous nourrir. Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspirent, qui installent dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiants, d'assister. Nous devons mettre de côté ces aides par notre grande production. Il faut réussir à produire plus. Produire plus. Produire plus parce que il est normal que celui qui vous donne à manger vous dicte également.
Sankara actually grew up in what many would say was a relatively privileged family, in that his father was a functionary in the colonial regime. His family actually wanted him to go to a seminary, wanted him to become a priest, but he decided to go to sign up into the military because that was one of the few national-oriented organizations. And when he was in the military, that's when he actually met with a professor who was a civilian teaching in the schools, and started giving him more like a personal tutorial into history, into the history of imperialism, into the Chinese Revolution, into the colonial history and neo-colonialism. So that really elevated his consciousness. And then he had another opportunity to be trained in Madagascar, And over there, he actually also learned about agrarian reform and land reform in agriculture and how to produce crops efficiently. Blaise Compaoré was a very good organizer. And in fact, it was Blaise Compaoré who helped organize and hatch the coup. But he realized that Sankara was tremendously charismatic and just knew a lot more than he did when it came to politics. And that's why Sankara became president and Blaise Compaoré became his number two.
First of all, he changed the name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meant land of the righteous people, or the upright people, or the incorruptible people.
West Africa, it's very semi-arid because of desertification, rapid desertification, and it was totally dependent on food from France and other countries. And that was one of the things that actually really motivated him.
Il y en a qui demandent, mais où se trouve l'impérialisme? L'impérialisme, regardez dans vos assiettes.
Simple
Quand
ask
vous
me, what is
mangez
imperialism? Just look in your plates when you
les
eat.
grains de riz, de maïs, de mil
Some
importés,
imported
c'est
corn,
ça
rice,
l'impérialisme.
millet.
N'allez pas plus loin.
This is imperialism.
And his number one priority, I think, was food independence, food self-sufficiency. If you can't grow your own food, you are totally not only in a neo-colonial relationship, but you are in fact in a colonial relationship.
Within 3 years, the country became food sufficient. And he went to some of the urban areas that had these ramshackle buildings. And he said, why are you living in these kind of, when you can actually make solid buildings that also look good? And nobody had told people that this is what you should do. They did that. The country built its first rail line that was domestically built with domestic resources without getting a loan for it because everybody rolled up their sleeves, including he himself.
For the first time, Burkinabe, as the people are called, the people of Burkina Faso, plant 10 million trees. And people start understanding that they can actually fight and reverse their condition.
Ce qui veut dire que nous devons
We
donner
must
à
give
chaque
a job to every
femme
woman of this country.
un emploi. Nous devons donner
Must
à
give
chaque
every
femme
woman
le moyen de
the
gagner
means to earn
honnêtement
an
et
honest and
dignement sa
decent
vie.
living.
He
Oh, the means
empowered
to earn
women,
an
for
honest and decent
example.
living.
He didn't give them just token jobs. He actually gave them real jobs like officials in the government, ministers in the government, recruited them in the military, had them trained and joined the army as weapons. That had never been seen before. On Women's Day, he said the men should go out and shop today so they understand, how women have been able to keep them alive with the little money that they provide to them.
Quand les filles sont en grossesse ou des choses comme ça, on les renvoie, n'est-ce pas? On les exclut. Mais on ne cherche même pas à savoir si le partenaire avec lequel elle a eu la grossesse là ne se trouve pas par hasard dans la
by
classe.
any chance in the same class or not. External forces started to take notice.
The broad umbrella is French imperialism.
France controls most of the former colonies in West Africa by controlling the economies.
The currencies of most of those former French colonies are pegged to the French franc.
France would then invest their funds on their behalf. If things go wrong, too bad.
And obviously, when they saw that Sankara was presenting a threat to this, they made the determination to eliminate him. France also has its actors on the African continent, such as, for example, the president of the Ivory Coast, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who was actually like a regional representative of French interests. And Houphouët-Boigny had a very close relationship with Blaise Compaoré. Thomas Sankara knew that he was in a very perilous position. Sankara, when he paid a visit to France, one of the questions he was getting from French journalists was that why did he actually dare to pay a visit to the Soviet Union?
Et ailleurs aussi.
I've been in Moscow and Cuba,
Je n'ai
but
pas
other
seulement
places as
été dans
well.
ces pays-là, parce que nous entretenons d'excellentes relations avec ces pays, avec les dirigeants de ces pays. Nous avons des projets
There are projects that are
qui
extremely
nous paraissent
important
extrêmement
for our development.
importants pour notre développement. Nous recherchons des
Looking for
partenaires.
partners.
Si
Country close to
un
us makes us
pays
offers.
plus proche peut
see no
nous éviter
objections.
un long déplacement jusqu'à Moscou, nous
Save
voyons
us traveling as far
absolument
as
aucun
Moscow.
inconvénient.
Sankara's strategy of non-alignment for Burkina Faso undermined French power in Africa.
What became his death warrant was when he attended the 1987 Organization of African Unity meeting in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia.
Qui ici ne souhaite pas
Who in
que la
this
dette soit
room
purement
does not
simplement
wish
effacée?
to see our debt simply canceled?
Celui qui ne le souhaite pas, il
If you
peut
don't, you
sortir,
can't take this
prendre son
first
avion
flight.
et aller tout de suite à la Banque
You know,
mondiale
you can take this
payer.
first flight to go and pay to the World Bank.
Tous nous souhaitons.
It's our common wish.
He said, listen, we cannot develop our economy so long as we have this huge debt burden above us. We need to do something about this. We need to have these debts canceled, but I can't do it alone. If I do it alone, I will not be here attending the next conference. And lo and behold, it turned out to be true.
Si le Burkina Faso tout seul refuse de
If
payer
Burkina
la
Faso
dette,
is the only
je
one
ne
to
serai pas là à la
refuse,
prochaine conférence.
we won't be at the next conference.
Par contre,
On the other hand, with
avec le
everybody's
soutien de
support,
tous dont j'ai besoin,
And you can see the African leaders are sort of nodding and agreeing. They knew he was speaking truth to power, but none of them were willing to act on it and join him in taking mass collective action.
That was July 1987. October, he was dead, 1987. And at that time, Houphouët-Boigny was very close to France. He was given the dirty job to convince Blaise to get rid of Sankara because the example that Sankara was setting was spreading in West Africa, was spreading throughout the African continent.
Sankara was shot viciously, I think as many as maybe 12 times, a bullet riddle, with about maybe a dozen of his colleagues. They'd been in a meeting, and he had been warned. He had been warned several times before by his own intelligence services that Compaoré is plotting to get rid of you. The best thing is for you to get rid of him first. That's not his nature. If that's what Compaoré decides to do, then so be it. He has the support of the masses.
Sankara was assassinated on October 15th, 1987. He was killed by armed troops organized by
So he was
Compaoré.
killed, and the body was buried secretly in an unmarked grave. And then, of course, Compaoré had the press conference saying he found out that Sankara was planning to get rid of him, and that's why people that were loyal to him in the military decided to get rid of Sankara, which was completely out of the fault, of course. And then he was in power until 2014. He had 4 phony elections. And then in 2014, when he wanted to amend the Constitution, by that time, there was actually a Constitution that had presidential term limits, I believe, of 2 terms. And he had served out the second term. When he tried to do that, then he found out that people had reached their limit. And the youth, young people, they stormed the parliamentary building and they burned down the parliament. And that's when the army that was sustaining him realized that they had a choice. Are they going to continue maintaining this dictator, or will they side with the masses? Compaoré came out and saying he was going to form a transitional government and then he would leave at the end of the 1-year transition. But people would not have it. They started marching toward his mansion, and that's when he decided to get out of town in a hurry. And the interesting thing is, many of the young folks that came out to the streets and drove Compaoré away, many were teenagers. They were not born when Sankara was killed, but many of them were wearing Thomas Sankara T-shirts. So obviously his legacy is well alive in Burkina Faso.
Je me retrouve un peu comme
I will find myself like a
un
cyclist
cycliste qui grimpe une pente
going up a
raide,
steep slope
qui a à gauche, à
with
droite
precipice
des
on each
précipices.
side.
Il est obligé de pédaler, de
He has
continuer
no
de
other
pédaler.
choice than
Sinon,
pedaling,
il tombe.
otherwise he'll fall.
Alors, pour rester moi-même
To
et pour me
remain true to
sentir
myself
moi-même, je suis obligé de continuer dans cette
Keep on the
lancée-là.
same track.
Vous vous sentez isolé en Afrique?
You feel isolated in Africa?
Mal compris en tout cas.
Not
Mal
understood.
compris, mal aimé?
Not understood,
Mal-
like, not liked? Not liked,
Mal-
yes. Sorry, Forrest Miller. I said Forrest Whitaker. My bad. Anyways, everyone should go check out the rest of their
In
content.
our efforts for recovery, we
Stop.
have avoided on the
Stop. Stop.
Produit
God damn it. There you go. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for tonight's show. I hope you enjoyed it. Share the show, hit the like button, all that fun stuff. I will be back for MCR later this week. Probably. Yeah, maybe later this week or next week. And what else? A documentary episode should come out, hopefully, fingers crossed, by my birthday in March. So hopefully before March, we'll get the next episode of History of Socialism, which will be covering Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, and Mikhail Bakunin, and the First Internationale period, of course. So that should be a fun one to research and produce and all that fun stuff. And obviously, I showed this video of illicit history of TMBS because, A, I like the content, but also in homage to them, everyone over there, because I wouldn't be doing History of Socialism without Michael Brooks, TMBS, and illicit history. I just wouldn't. This is one of my main inspirations for that series. So absolutely want to pay it some homage in what it has produced and the quality content that it is. Find me, Matt Hunter, MCR, all social media platforms right there. Link below in the description. Have a happy new year. Stay safe out there. Remember, guys, at all time, fuck the police and free Palestine. Have a good one. Peace.